Welcome to today's BSI webinar entitled Counterfeit Parts and Risks in Work Transfers. In an effort to minimize background noise, we have muted all phone lines. As always, we encourage questions and comments throughout the presentation using the chat box located on the left-hand side of your screen. This applies to any technical assistance you may need, as well as submitting questions which will be answered at the end if time permits. All of today's participants will receive a link to enroll for a recording of today's event. Lastly, we ask you to participate in a brief survey following the web conference. We appreciate feedback and suggestions to improve our future webinars. Before I turn it over to our presenter, allow me a few moments of introduction. Today's webinar will be led by Brendon Hill. Brendon has been in aviation and engineering for 40+ years, including 26 years as a British Army officer, an aircraft engineer, and serving in many areas of operation as well as in quality management roles. Brendon has been in business assurance and certification for over 10 years, and he has developed BSI services for aerospace. Today, Brendon is our global head of aerospace, and he has worked in the industry as a group quality manager for 3 factories, 2 CNC manufacturing plants, which supplied aerospace as well as other sectors such as oil and gas, and 1 producing manufacturing software. I'll turn it over now to you, Brendon.
Thank you, Anne, and hello everybody, and welcome to this webinar. It's going to be quite a busy one. We've got an hour, but I've got quite a lot of information to share, so the pace will be fairly quick. But if you have any questions, do please type them in, and I'll do my best to answer them at the end. So let's crack on. So the agenda then, a quick introduction to BSI for those who perhaps don't know who we are. Look at counterfeits and SUPs, unapproved parts, prevention, detection, some sources of information and best practice. So it's a fairly wide range of things. And let's get on to BSI. So BSI, British Standards Institute. We're the world's first national standards body, and we have a royal charter, which means that we are not owned by anybody. We don't have conventional ownership. We're not beholden to shareholders or anybody. And our whole purpose is to work for the public good. So a royal charter is granted by the sovereign, the Queen, and it's only for organisations such as ours which work for the public good, which perhaps differentiates us from other certification bodies. We've been around for quite a long time. As I said, we're the world's first national standards body, so we now work in 193 countries, including perhaps bizarrely Antarctica, and we have 84,000 clients. And as you can see on the right, we work with a lot of the world's largest and most important companies, 84% of the FTSE 100, 50% of the Fortune 500, 81% of the Nikkei 225 index. So we work with companies large and small, and our ability to support you in business assurance is where we add value. And of course, a lot of the standards that you'll be familiar with, we wrote. So the Quality Management Standard 9001 started life as BS 5750. 14001 started off as BS 7750, and so it goes on. You can see that a lot of the key standards that influence the world now, the way the world works, the way we operate, the way business works, all originated with BSI. So we have that thought leadership, that generation, that innovation that supports industry. We have several key streams to support you. Standards, of course, we write standards, and these standards cover every aspect. It could be materials, it could be calibration, it could be testing, and of course there are system standards such as the ones we've already mentioned. So there are actually hundreds of aerospace standards that we write and those are all available on our online portal, BSOL, British Standards Online. Certification, we provide certification services to give you business assurance so you and your supply chain can be assured that businesses with whom you work are reputable and can provide the quality and services that you need. Obviously, they need training, so we provide training in all these standards and indeed in the various tools. such as APQP, MSA, Lean, and all the other bits and pieces that contribute to making those systems effective. We have an entirely independent part of BSI which can provide consultancy. And then we have product testing. Product testing has been around since 1903. So we have laboratories in the UK and indeed in other places where we can do testing, whether it's materials testing, product testing, Internet of Things. So we have a broad portfolio. So that gives you an idea of BSI's range of services. So let's get on to the meat of today. Counterfeits and unapproved parts. How big a problem is it? Well, let's have a look. Let's start looking at some definitions. A counterfeit part, this is from the AS9100 standard, is an unauthorized copy, an imitation. So it was knowingly created to misrepresent itself as a specified genuine part. So it's something which is being presented knowingly as a false part. And of course, there's a lot of money in that. So this is why they do it. Fundamentally, it's driven by money. This is slightly different to an unapproved part, because an unapproved part is something where there is credible evidence indicating the part is likely to be unapproved or counterfeit. So a counterfeit part is an unapproved part, but a part which is unapproved, it may be because of its provenance. So it may be a genuine part, but it may not have the correct release, or it may not have been serviced by an approved body. It may not have the correct documentation. So it becomes an unapproved part because of its provenance, its sourcing. So it's slightly different. So moving on from the definitions then, let's look at the scale and the issues we have. It can apply to anything. Raw materials, and there are plenty of cases or examples of that, and we'll look at some of that a bit later. So it could be raw materials, chemicals, metals, plastics. It could be parts and assemblies. Most often these are electronic, but it could be any type of part, including commercial off-the-shelf parts and standard parts. Then we have consumables, chemicals, adhesives, welding rods, solder, fuels. And then you've got outsourced work. So we talked about unapproved parts, and we talked about those having the incorrect provenance. So if something has been serviced by somebody who doesn't have the correct 145 approval, for example, or is not able to provide an EASA Form 1 or an FAA 8130, then it becomes an unapproved part because it's been outsourced to somebody that's not approved to do that work. And then something that perhaps often gets overlooked is conflict materials. We're perhaps aware of conflict diamonds, but let's not overlook the fact that conflict raw materials are pertinent as well. And then looking at where we are today, world events. Now with COVID, there have been a lot of scams to do with falsification of PPE certificates. Indeed, they've been falsifying some BSI certificates. The good news for BSI is that any BSI certificate is on a portal we have called Verify. So if you need to look at, or if you need to verify any BSI certificate at any time, you can just go to the Verify portal, type in the company name, and it will come up if it's a genuine BSI certificate. So it's very easy to check. Now for aerospace, of course, if it's an aerospace certificate, an AS9100 series certificate, you can just check on Oasis. But for other things, perhaps more difficult. The thing is, just because there's a certificate, you don't have to, don't take it as a given that that's a genuine certificate. People are creative. They falsify materials. They also falsify the documentation and provenance. And also, don't just think about things related to your product. Also think about your infrastructure. So your internal systems, your tooling, your IT, your maintenance of your lifting equipment, for example. So it's not just about the product and the deliverables that you have, but it's about your infrastructure as well. So looking at the scale, that's quite a scary statistic. 15% of all materials bought by the US military are counterfeit. That's quite a scary figure. Now you think about what those things go into: aircraft, ships, missiles, weapon systems, rather worrying. And then the Semiconductor Industry Association, to put some dollar indication on it, looks at PCB components, so that's just one type of counterfeit. PCB components cost manufacturers more than $7.5 billion annually. So that's just one type of potential counterfeit that we need to consider. So sources of information or scaling. In 2019, EASA listed 23 reports of unapproved parts. Interestingly, the FAA listed 0. Quite why it should be so different, I don't know. This year, 2020, they have each listed 1, and they're both the same one. But there is a source of information for you there to go to the unapproved parts notifications on the FAA website, or the unapproved parts notification on EASA, and of course there will be other equivalents for other civil aviation authorities. So you can go and look at those to try and identify any unapproved parts notifications. But looking at those numbers, it makes you wonder. So we had the SIA saying that $7.5 billion is the cost of PCBs annually, and then we have one SUP, or one unapproved part notification so far this year, and then 23 last year. So the question you need to ask yourself is, are we detecting and treating 100% of unapproved parts? I think perhaps it would be naive to think that that's the case. So let's look at the old Pareto, the 80-20 rule. So are we detecting 80% and 20% go undetected, or the other way around? And of course the worrying thing is nobody knows. So we have to be perhaps cynical or realistic, depending on your philosophical viewpoint, and adopt a risk-based approach to everything we do to acquiring parts, products, materials, consumables, etc. So I highlighted some things in red there to pick out the keywords from this statement. Procurement is the main entry point for counterfeits due to unapproved suppliers, lack of part authentication, lack of communication and cooperation between suppliers and customers. So that's how you manage your supply chain up and down and across. Insufficient inventory control procedures and limited counterfeit avoidance procurement practices. So there's quite a lot of stuff in there we're going to talk about. So every company needs to assess its risks and identify what steps it needs to take. But complacency seems to stop them. It's perhaps disappointing that when we look at companies, or when you go to audit companies and ask about their supplier approval, and you ask about their prevention of counterfeits practices and their verification of purchased products or services, quite often it's somewhat lacking, shall we say. So complacency is your enemy. So we need to look at that complacency. So that comes down to leadership and culture. But then you have other pressures as well, the business environment. There's the inevitable cost down pressure. Everyone's looking for things which are cheaper and quicker to supply. And of course, at the moment, we have the issue of suppliers that potentially are unable to deliver because they're furloughed or stood down, so you need to find an alternate supplier. So straight away, you've got a whole series of risks to consider if you are looking to find a different source. Obsolescence is a big issue for aircraft because aircraft have a relatively long life. You compare that to a car, for example. So the aircraft has a long life, and of course every aircraft is certified, and that depends on the parts that constitute that aircraft at the point of certification. So as an aircraft goes through its life, obsolescence can become an issue, shortage of available parts. So the temptation is to go elsewhere or find whatever you can on the market and start looking at brokers and so on. So there are these various pressures, and ultimately leadership and culture is what's going to save you or help you avoid these things. This is just to give an indication of what we have to worry about. The top left picture is quite clearly an issue, but unless you were to cut the wire, you wouldn't know, because all you'd see is the outer insulation. And the picture on the right shows the kind of problem with waste electronic equipment being recycled. That means that thousands of parts are being stripped from motherboards and looking to be recycled. And of course, if they recycle a part as a standard part, it might be worth a few pence. If they recycle it as an aircraft part, So they blacktop it, rename it, give it different identity, make it look like something much more expensive. They can increase its value by tens or even hundreds of times. So the temptation is quite significant. Some of the examples that I'm aware of, counterfeit parts used in navigation systems. Quite worrying when you think about that, going into a missile, for example, or an aircraft or a ship. And these are all Department of Defense examples, so it's all military related. Self-locking nuts on aircraft braking systems. Titanium used in fighter engine mounts, but it could equally be in armor that protects the crew. And then brake shoes. I'm fascinated by the concept of brake shoes made by seaweed, but there we are, it exists. This is quite a recent one. 103 people were arrested in China because they were making counterfeit Loctite. Now, at adhesive, you might think, or you might approach it in a different way. Thinking about the counterfeit part, you might take appropriate steps. But looking at a Loctite adhesive, you might think, well, glue is glue. But you think about what that does, thread lock, bearing lock, and so on, and then the concept of this having been in production for several years and the potential effect of an adhesive failure on an aircraft, then it becomes much more significant. So even things like that, as simple as consumables, need to be considered. Now, Loctite have done some things about that. And this is interesting because they've made some changes to the bottle to try and counter the counterfeiters. But if you're not aware of those things, and if you're not aware of what to look for, then you wouldn't check them. So awareness of these things is critical. So your product verification and counterfeit prevention activities needs to include awareness of what the manufacturers are doing to identify the genuine from the fake. Outsourcing. So where do your parts or materials really come from? And do they hold the right approvals? Lack of visibility of the supply chain is quite an issue. How many tiers down does your supplier approval process look? Most often I see that companies look at their direct suppliers and that's it. Very rarely do I see them go down to their suppliers, particularly looking at raw materials or special processes, the things which arguably are more critical. And then when you get to an urgent situation brought about by things such as the COVID situation, you need a product or a service, but your usual supplier is out of action. So you've got to find an alternate supplier. So it's a work transfer. You're looking at finding an alternative supplier. Straight away, your risk alarm should be going off in your head and looking very thoroughly at any potential suppliers of that product or service. Deliberate falsification of materials and traceability even from trusted sources. Trusted sources. So there are certain people you think, yeah, they're good, we trust them, we don't need to worry about them. There's the example I'm sure most of you know about with Kobe Steel, where they had been making fraudulent representations on their certificates for 50 years. 50 years. So even the organizations that you think have been around for a long time and can be trusted, don't take it as a given that things are correct. And in the AS9100 series, it does say that if you receive materials, then you should do appropriate testing of those materials to verify that they are what they say they are. So if you're getting steel, for example, then at an appropriate frequency, you do some testing, chemical analysis, hardness testing, whatever else is appropriate to verify the characteristics of that material. Don't take it as a given that because they're a well-known company, it's good stuff. Deliberate falsification of parts history and maintenance release. Okay. What do we mean by that? Non-repairable parts being brought back into service. Okay. Outsourcing means that there is a propensity for risk to increase exponentially, says an FAA inspector. I'm working towards an example as I skip through these. Improperly manufactured parts have been installed in a Boeing 777. This is quite a well-known one. these were aerodynamic sections that go on the wings, air brakes, and Boeing bought them from Moog. Moog bought them from somebody else, and somewhere down the chain, the production got outsourced to an unapproved supplier. And I believe there was something in the order of 300 or so identified parts that were brought into service and indeed fitted to aircraft because they were outsourced to an unapproved supplier. So that visibility down the supply chain at some stage broke down. Critically, there were single point of failure parts. If they fail, the whole system fails, i.e. the aircraft could fall out of the sky, which is not a good thing. A couple of things we've come across. Auditing a company, a 9120 company, and asking them about the supply of electronic parts. And they said, well, they're from the OEM, so they must be fine. We require a manufacturer's C of C. So we looked into them a bit further. The OEM doesn't make them. The manufacturer is done and outsourced to a variety of companies in the Far East, Thailand, India. So straight away, there's an alarm bell going off. It's not a single source. It's not a single point of manufacture. It's a single CFC being issued by an organization with prominence. Where does that really come from? And we found that no records were available from the actual manufacturers in APAC. Are they really being provided with a manufacturer's CFC? Do they control the change of source? It's that visibility again of the supply chain. So if you think about the example of the Boeing 777 air brakes, and now we've got a different product being sourced ostensibly from the OEM, but that traceability has disappeared as you go down through the supply chain, then that's a risk. And importantly, the organization had not identified it or considered it. You've got a pattern and a culture. Here's another one. NASA, you would think they would have good systems in place, but metals fraud caused the failure of satellites. 700 million in losses and 2 failed satellites. Now the other things that it doesn't cover is what was the function of those satellites? What were they going to do? So what plans, what other projects had fallen down? So what was the true cost? There's the cost of the satellites, yeah, but what was the true cost? The function that those satellites were going to be put toward? Unknown. Mitsubishi, another well-known name. You can trust them. Yeah, they've been around since Pontius was an apprentice. Don't need to worry about Mitsubishi. But they were having seals in aircraft systems, which again did not come up to spec. And then another example in BSI, we had some distributors of materials. 9120 again, one ethical, one not. And to cut a story short, one of the suppliers was taking certificates from a mill and annotating them with a different product and sending that to a customer because the customer wanted a specific product from a specific mill, but the mill did not actually make that material. So the broker, the distributor, decided to falsify a certificate to meet the customer need. That was sufficiently important for me to report it to the CAA, by the way. There's another example in the US, 1,000 falsely marked microprocessors supplied, and the FAA supplied to an FAA-approved production holder. So this is another case of visibility of the supply chain leading to counterfeit parts getting into an approved holder. So any one of their customers might assume that the parts they're receiving are genuine, but actually they won't. So the visibility down through the supply chain becomes important. Other example, an A380 wheel assembly. Thought of one of those falling off, rather worrisome with potentially 800 souls on board. And they found that the rotor drive keys in service were either pre-production or had been modified, and indeed quality escapes. So parts which were non-compliant had got into service. So those are some examples of some larger parts, and let's look at low-spec components made to look like higher spec. We spoke earlier on about PCBs. Counterfeiters are removing the part numbers from low-spec components and replacing them with the part numbers of higher spec components. So they look the same. Physically on the outside, they look the same. Very difficult to tell the difference. Put those into some high spec packaging, so it looks like a very expensive part, and potentially you've got a part worth 3 pence or 3 cents that you could sell for $30, $100, whatever. So the motivation is huge because the profit potential is huge. So it looks like a totally different part. And you can't tell from the outside. They're passed off as qualified parts. But there might be some telltale things on there that you can use to try and identify what those are, and we'll cover some of those a bit later. Counterfeits taking old parts. We talked about the stripping down of waste electronic components, taking those old parts and making them look like new ones. And now this might be genuine parts which are old and they're taking off and making them look new, or it might be parts which are totally different, as mentioned earlier, which they're representing as a totally different part, putting a different part number on. The net effect is the same. You're not getting what you paid for. Looking at engines, this is a particularly worrisome one. We've all seen in the last year or two occasions where a blade has let go in an engine, and the consequences have been very unfortunate. There was a case of a blade where it went through a window on an aircraft and one passenger was sucked out of the aircraft. Now, I'm not suggesting that particular one was a counterfeit, but the point of the consequence of the failure is important. And in this case, there were a set of blades in CFM 56, and you look at the difference in the life, the true life, versus the life that the paperwork said those blades had. 31,000 hours versus 2,600 hours. 4,207 cycles versus 482. Huge difference. And of course, the potential consequence of that is enormous. Flap angle indicator, a POA in the UK informed EASA about its suspected unapproved parts with a forged EASA Form 1. So these guys were on the case. They identified that the EASA Form 1, which is equivalent to an 8130, was a forgery, and none of the parts were genuine. Obsolescence we've spoken about earlier on. The discontinuation of a part makes them rare, hard to find, so the pressure is greater. Potentially, if they're hard to find, they become more expensive, so the motivation to falsify those parts becomes greater. So if you're looking for obsolescent parts, then that needs to be part of your risk planning. So let's look at some of the practices you can have. What does 9100 say? 9100 talks about a definition of a counterfeit part and an unapproved part. And then it says this: prevention of counterfeit parts. The organisation shall plan, implement and control process for the prevention of counterfeit parts. Shall. So you have to do it if you're certified. You have to have processes to do that. And verification activities shall include inspection or periodic testing. Remember I mentioned the Kobe Steel example earlier on, where there is a high risk of counterfeit parts. Now, if you're getting a first batch from a new supplier, that might be your point initially to do some verification testing. And then you'd pick a frequency which you might reduce over time based on confidence. But the old adage of don't assume, check, stands good there. Organisation shall communicate its requirements for prevention of the use of counterfeit parts. That's in 843. So that's a flow down to your supply chain. So you're telling your supply chain what you need them to do to prevent counterfeit parts. And in that, you can require them, in turn, to flow it down. So don't just end at, well, I need you to do this. It should be, I need you to do this, and I need all your suppliers to do this as well, and I need you to be able to demonstrate that and manage it. And of course, certification can help that. Outputs: if you detect counterfeits or suspect counterfeit parts, control them, quarantine them, and importantly, report them. Remember, I showed you a couple of screenshots earlier on of the EASA and FAA notification of unapproved parts. Report those things to the relevant bodies. You'll be doing yourself a favour and hopefully the industry a favour as well. Breaking down what it says about unapproved parts, talks about training of appropriate persons in the awareness and identification of suspected unapproved parts. Remember the diagram or the picture of the Loctite bottle earlier on. How many people in receipt in your business would be aware of what to look for on a Loctite bottle to make sure that it's a genuine one and not a counterfeit? So if you extrapolate that to whatever it is you receive from your suppliers, and that could be a range of things. Remember, we were talking about consumables, materials, parts, even special products. Any of those things, you need to train people to identify or to be aware of, to be able to identify anything which is not as it should be. They need to understand traceability. So your purchasing people need to make sure they flow down those requirements for traceability. Inspection processes to detect unapproved parts. So your risk question is, what do we buy in? What is the probability or the likelihood of that being an unapproved or a counterfeit part? And what do we need to do about it? How can we test it? Whether it's a PCB or it's a raw material or a part or the documentation associated with that, the 8130, the FAA Form 1, the manufacturer's CFC, and so on. All of those things. So training and awareness. And of course engagement, that becomes culture. And culture comes from leadership. So this will only work if the leadership at the top says, this is how we are going to do business. And ultimately, of course, quarantine and report any suspected unapproved parts. So it's often done poorly or superficially. As I said earlier, when we go out to do audits, or when I go and do some audits, and I talk in depth about the people doing the verification of purchased product or the people flowing down the requirements, it's perhaps somewhat disappointing that they don't fully understand what they need to look for, what the risks are. They haven't identified the risks, and therefore they're not managing the risks. The AS standard mentions the word risk something like 60 times. It requires you to apply risk-based thinking to everything you do. And of course, procurement, flow down of requirements, prevention of counterfeits, risk-based thinking is the key for that. There are so many things you need to think about. It's not impossible to do, but you really do need to sit down and think about it, perhaps as a team, collectively, and say, what are the risks? What are the things we need to be aware of? How are we going to manage those? And how do we keep ourselves up to date? Going back to the example of the Loctite bottle that they've changed. So what do you flow down to your suppliers regarding counterfeits? What do you require them to flow down to their suppliers? Do you conduct second-party audits? Do they conduct second-party audits, i.e. go and look at their supply chain? What certification do you require them to have? Do you require them to have 9100, 9110, 9120? And that becomes particularly pertinent when we start looking at brokers a bit later. So how far down do you know your supply chain? And the next level, and the next level. Then we need to look at detection. So the standard says counterfeit parts prevention should consider training in awareness and prevention. We've talked about that. Obsolescence monitoring program. Now it may be that you're buying in things, so you need to be aware of the obsolescence program. But if you're a DA, then you need to build the obsolescence planning into your design. And you need controls for acquiring product from original or authorized manufacturers. So we're getting into the world of unapproved parts there. So it's not just what the part is, but whether it has the right provenance, the right documentation, the right approvals, and so on. Traceability, and your verification methodologies. And of course, they will vary depending on what it is you're buying in. And then the monitoring of counterfeit parts reports from external sources. I showed you two earlier on. the FAA and the EASA. So how many people monitor those? Should be part of the one of the activities of your procurement department or perhaps your quality department to look at those reports and keep up to date with those and other sources. Manufacturers, for example. Then quarantine and report anything which you suspect is counterfeit. The biggest risk arguably is in electronics, but all parts and materials can be counterfeited. Anything can be counterfeited. The motivation to counterfeit it is quite significant because of the value. So, materials, you need to look at mill certs. As an example of a fake mill cert. So they're out there. These are some things you might be able to identify as indicators of fraud on documentation. Now this presentation is going to be available on YouTube and various other things later, so I won't dwell too long on this. But you got wrong logos, wrong letterheads, vague certification, facility not authorized, unauthorized signatures, backdated documents. You could have documents where the text is out of line, so cut and pasted. Whiteouts, test results seem to be the same, so every batch seems to have the same results. Incomplete documentation, missing documentation. So these are indicators perhaps of fraud. And a classic, we had an organization that the biggest they can handle is 20 tons, but there was some documentation that alluded to a batch of 96 tons. That would take quite something to handle, I suggest. So there are some things which you can pick up just by the, is that real? Correct approvals. Sold articles to aerospace customers from September 2007 up to about, I think this is up to about 2018. So the organization was not a POA holder. So they couldn't produce the right documentation. So how could it be that for so long they are able to provide and sell articles to aerospace customers without the right documentation? Someone somewhere should have picked that up. We talked about this, documentation, parts and packaging. When the stuff is received, quite often when I talk to people about what they're doing, they say, oh, we check the quantity, we look at the part number, we look to see if it's the right, batch number, and that's pretty much as far as it goes. You talk to them about, okay, what about text alignment, misspellings, anything that looks untoward on the packaging, on the certification, the dates? Is it the same font? Is it as you would expect? There's a blank look. And these should be day-to-day activities that these people are aware of. Examining the part. Particularly on electronics, manufacturers make indents. If you look at PCBs and things, there are small indents on there. And this is a good clue. They should be uniform, they should be clean. And sometimes if they've been blacktopped, i.e. they've been rubbed down and recoated, then those markings are lost. So there are simple things that somebody who is aware and competent can use to identify counterfeit parts. You can even, based on the sampling, going back to what the standard says, that if there's a risk of counterfeits, you should take appropriate steps to verify them, then you could do periodic X-ray of those components, because you can't see from the outside what it looks like on the inside, but an X-ray can reveal internals that are nothing like the original part. Electrical testing seems obvious. Decapsulation, now sadly you have to take the part, you have to destroy the part to verify it, but this is your sampling exercise. Edge thickness, if it's been sanded down, then it might be thinner or unduly shiny or polished, so you can see that the part has been reworked by looking at the edges. Pins correctly spaced, oxidation or scratches. Sources of information. Okay, let's look through this. There's quite a lot of standards out there. We've talked about the 9100 series. Particularly for electronics, there are quite a few standards that you can apply. So if you're in the world of electronics, you should be aware of these and, as appropriate, be using them. AS553, 6081, 6328, 6496, 6174 alpha. All these standards are there to help you identify and manage counterfeits. So there are things out there that you could use. Some of these you can be certified to. AS6081, for example, you can be certified to that. Or you could require that your supply chain is certified to that. Remember, these standards are for you and your supply chain. You can flow them down and flow them down to more than one level. ISO has some standards, authenticating solutions to combat counterfeit goods. You've got some IEC standards as well. IEC, you've got a lot of useful information, so it's worth looking at the IEC range of standards and their information to see what you can find that's going to help you prevent counterfeits in electronics. And if you're supplying to the military, then you've got military standards to think about. MIL standards, UK, you've got DESTAN, defense standards, Department of Defense manuals, and whichever military you supply into, I'm sure they will have their respective equivalents of these. FAA and the EASA, there are regulations in there, of course, about counterfeits and DFARS. So there's lots of sources of information you can use to try and help you. I've just got some examples here. As I said, this webinar will be available to you later. But you've got the FAA SUPS program, the unapproved parts notification, the IAQG, the International Aerospace Quality Group, has a thing called the Supply Chain Management Handbook. There is extensive information in there on management and prevention of counterfeits. It's often overlooked. It's a free source of information. Go to the IAQG website. You just need to register to get access to the Supply Chain Management Handbook. And then you have extensive information on all aspects, indeed, of the IAQG standards. That's definitely worth looking at. So there's a lot of sources of information out there to help you and guide you. Excuse me. UK, they have this website which talks about anti-counterfeiting project. So there are lots of sources of information. That's an example, unapproved parts notification from the FAA. This is to do with communications. So there are sources out there you can go to. There are standards you can use. There are sources of information that keep you up to date with counterfeit problems, counterfeit materials, unapproved parts that have got into the supply chain. And of course, you are part of that source. So potentially, if you identify one of these, you do need to report it. Okay, don't just deal with it for yourself and put it to bed. You need to think about the wider industry. And remember, of course, we're all stakeholders. Every one of us flies pretty much under normal circumstances, not so much at the moment, but that makes us all very much stakeholders in the industry. Flight safety is pertinent to all of us. So let's have a quick look at some best practice application of risk-based thinking. As I said, the standard mentions the word risk something like 60 times. In everything you do, you should be applying risk-based thinking. So what are the risks? How will you manage them? And that will vary very much depending on what you're doing, what you're buying, what you're procuring, whether it's hardware, software, electronics, services, special processes. But as I said before, don't forget your infrastructure as well. That's just as vulnerable to counterfeiting. It doesn't become a deliverable, but it could affect your internal business. So apply risk-based thinking through everything you do. Training is critical. And once you've applied the risk-based thinking, then you've got to look at the sources of information. You've got to look at what do our people need to know. I go back to the example of the light bottle. It's no good the manufacturer changing things if nobody's aware of it. So you need to be up to speed and monitoring for all these changes and provide that training and update the training as you go through so that the people that are flowing down requirements to your suppliers, so your procurement people, the people that are verifying the received products, the people that set the criteria for sampling, so the quality team perhaps, the frequency and the criteria and the tools for sampling, all those people need to be aware of all the risks, be engaged in creating the controls and mechanisms you'll put in place, and then trained so they are aware of what to do, how to do it, what to look for. And of course, they need to then be engaged, so that comes from the leadership. If people are not engaged and aware and care about what they're doing and apply themselves to the job in hand, then the training isn't going to work. And of course, that applies to everything. So culture comes from leadership. So the leadership is critical to all these things. Parts obsolescence management, whether you're buying, then you have one set of risks. If you're designing, then you need to try and build that into your design planning in the first place, planning for obsolescence management and the projected life of that part or that aircraft or that system. Robust supplier evaluation and management. I often see that to approve a supplier, companies have a questionnaire, they send it out, they get the questionnaire back. If everything is answered yes, they put them on the approved suppliers list. Very little in the way of risk-based thinking, very little in the way of applying particular tests or particular requirements for different suppliers. And the verification of certificates. There are means of doing that. As I said, if it's an aerospace cert, an AS cert, you can look on Oasis. If it's a BSI certificate, you can look on Verify. But any certificate you get, you should be applying intelligent critical review to that. Is it real? Is it genuine? Is it current? Has it been edited? Has it been changed? I go back to the example of PPE certificates at the moment, which are being falsified because that's where the money is. So, robust supplier evaluation and management. And those certificates, of course, they have a 3-year cycle. So you need to be checking those and monitoring them to make sure that they've requalified, they've passed their recertification. So thorough and effective verification process, looking at the products and materials that come in, every aspect of them, not just counting them or weighing them and looking to see that the part number's right, really looking at them critically to make sure they are what they purport to be, that they have the right provenance, the right documentation, the documentation is genuine, it's not been falsified, it's not been edited. Currency, keeping yourself up to date, monitor the relevant data sources for notifications. If you do find any of the things, quarantine them or destroy them. Probably not much good to send them back to a supplier who is knowingly providing counterfeit parts, because he's just going to sell them on to somebody else. So you need to quarantine them or destroy them and then report them to the appropriate body. And use the relevant standards. So let's look at what we can do to help. So time-wise, we're doing well. BSI has a range of services to help you out here. We have an approach to everything we do, which is based on resilience, organizational resilience. And we break that down into 3 domains. And one of those domains is supply chain resilience. So we have supply chain management tools. We can help you with risk mapping, compliance, supply development. We can do on-site services. We can do second-party audits for you. If you don't have the capacity or the capability to go and audit your suppliers, and remember that could be down more than one level, then there's no reason why you can't employ us to go and do on-site audits of your suppliers or on-site audits of their product. We have risk and intelligence monitoring software, and we've got various tools. So we have a thing called Screen, which is a web-based tool, and this gives daily reports. Every day I get a report from Screen which tells me of issues around the world, disruptions, hijacks, reported counterfeits, major incidents, so anything that might impact adversely on your supply chain, not just counterfeit, but anything that could upset your supply chain. That is notified on Screen. So you get a daily intelligence report, and any of those which are pertinent to you, click onto it, and it takes you to the relevant page, the relevant documentation. So you can look at it, assess it, and decide what you need to do about it. So it's a really good source of information. That's an example of the email that comes in. So today's top supply chain headlines, not surprisingly, COVID is at the top. And then we've got things like forced labor, food and beverage products stolen in Kenya. So it covers every sector, but you can narrow it down to your particular sector. And then if you click on those, it takes you to a more detailed source of information, gives you a breakdown of exactly what that particular issue is. So in terms of your procurement people being aware of what's going on in the world, any aspect of what's going on in the world, not just counterfeits, Screen is an exceptionally good tool. And at the moment, because of the COVID issue, you might be interested to know that we've opened access to all the COVID-19 information on our Screen tool. So if you want to get access to the COVID-19 information on Screen, please contact your local BSI office or let us know after this webinar, and we'll help you out with that. These are some other examples of the Screen headlines, and this is particularly about COVID and scams. So I've highlighted this because this is all about counterfeiting. So this is examples of counterfeiting products being notified through Screen. Granted, it's mostly COVID related, but you get the point. On certificates, any BSI certificate, if you have a certificate and you suspect it may be falsified, you can simply look up this this verified directory. You don't have to register, you don't have to do anything, just go to the verified directory, type the company name into the bar there, and it will give you a return to tell you about that company. There are two types of profile on there. There's the basic profile. So anyone that's certified by BSI to 9001, 14001, 9100, 27001, whatever it might be, they by default have a basic profile on Verify. So they will always be on there. Now what you can do is have a more detailed profile, and that means that BSI goes on site and verifies that company. They look at the site, the organization, they look at their financial status, and on the verified profile you can have videos, virtual tours of the site, you have photographs, lots of information about the company. Different audits to a 9100 or a 14001 audit. It's an audit about the company itself, and their standing and their viability. It's a good tool actually that you could use for your supply chain. So you could require that your supply chain has a BSI Verify full profile, for example. So it's an exceptionally useful tool. Customized audits, we mentioned this earlier. We can deliver second-party audits, and this can be a tailored audit. So it can be against any criteria you specify. So it could be your QMS requirements. You might have a set of QMS requirements that you flow down to your suppliers and down through the supply chain. Or it could be against specific standards, such as some that we've mentioned earlier on, such as 453, 6081, etc. So we can conduct a tailored audit, custom audit against any criteria. And we can also do product audits. We do these for various customers. So we go and look at the product and look at all aspects of the product realization, going right back to design, to the sourcing of all the materials, all the traceability, all the documentation. So all of these things we can do. And product testing. We can do product testing in our BSI laboratories, and that could be materials, it can be products. We do things testing to check them for hackability. So there's all sorts of things we can do to help you there. So the bottom line is we are experts in the field. We can do a lot of things to help you build resilience into your supply chain through our range of tools and services, which I hope you can see would benefit you. So I think at this stage I'm going to hand back to Anne, and then we'll look at any questions. So thank you for your attention.
Absolutely. Thank you, Brendon. We do have some new courses online. We have been doing Connected Learning Live courses are online platform for training for 5 years. We are now able to provide AS9100 lead auditor courses, and this is the schedule that we have coming up. I did want to make everyone aware of that. So, Brendon, let's go on to the questions.
Okay, yeah, we've got a couple of questions here. So, if the customer supplies the direct materials, what should the extent of control be? A good question. The standard says that it does not absolve you of responsibility for the conformance of that product or service. So this is where you apply your risk-based thinking. So if the customer provides that material, or if they mandate indeed that you buy a product or service from one of their approved suppliers, you still have to do your due diligence. So you still have to apply the same controls in effect. So what are the risks? Where does it come from? What is the nature of that product or material? What is the documentation that it has or should have? And what prevention steps do we need to take? So the risk would be the same. It might perhaps be somewhat mitigated if the customer supplies it, but then you don't know what their controls are. How far do they go in their steps to identify and prevent counterfeits? So the responsibility still rests with you. So you need to identify those risks and take appropriate steps. Next question, for electronic parts, are there new efforts by OCMs to provide characteristics that can be checked to identify parts? It's down to the individual company. They do have some of the characteristics that I've mentioned earlier on, such as the indentations, which can help. Manufacturers are also aware of the problem with the technique known as black topping. So they are taking steps to prevent black topping or to make it obvious that black topping has occurred. But as for individual OCMs taking steps to prevent or to help you out with that, you'd have to look at each of those suppliers. I think the best example is to go back to the Loctite bottle, where a company has been made aware that somebody is falsifying their product. It is in their interest to do something about it and to make it easier for customers to identify the genuine from the fake. So I think if you have any concerns about those parts, talk to the suppliers, talk to the manufacturers, talk to them about what they are doing to make it easier and simpler for you to identify those false parts, those counterfeit parts. Right, we've got a response to the first question. If it does not absolve the supplier, do we go all the way to send for lab tests to verify the material properties? Good question. Again, it comes down to risk. The standard talks about applying tests where there is a risk that the material may be counterfeit. I think if it's an unknown supplier or if it's a first-time supplier, you would probably apply your risk-based thinking and send the first batch or an element of the first batch off for testing. And of course, the extent of testing depends on what it is you're looking for. Some materials are relatively simple to test, and indeed you could have an in-house testing system. But if you need to send it off for chemical analysis, then it may be more difficult. But you look at the risk, the source of supply, the consequences of failure, the consequences of that being a false product or an incorrect product. And then you apply testing at a frequency that you consider as appropriate. So if we were coming in to audit you, for example, to talk to you or to understand what you've done, we would expect you to explain the risk, understand what you've done to mitigate the risk, and how you've decided upon the frequency of testing. I hope that answers the question from Dennis. I'm just reading the other comments he's put in a minute. Excuse me a moment. If it does not absolve the supplier, we go all the way to require the supplier we are auditing to send for lab tests to verify the material properties. Again, what you require from them it is up to you applying the risks. If you think there's a risk, if you think there's a potential problem with a material, send it away for independent testing. And then the frequency of that testing would be dependent on the risk as you perceive it and the consequences should there be a falsification of that. And that's why it's also important to keep up to date with what's going on around the world from sources such as Screen, so that you're aware of batches of false material coming from a particular country, for example. So I can't tell you how to manage the risk. All I can say is you need to be aware of the risk and take appropriate steps based on the intelligence you have about that product or service and the consequences of failure. So I think that answers all the questions there, I hope. So at that point, I'll hand back to Anne. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Brendon. And I also want to thank our audience for attending today's web conference. You can anticipate our follow-up email within the next 2 or 3 business days, which again will include a link to enroll in today's recording, along with a copy of the slides that Brendon used. Also, please do complete the survey to provide feedback and ideas for future webinars. We definitely appreciate and use your input. Be sure to join us again. Visit our website at www.bsiamerica.com/events to view upcoming webinars. Thank you and goodbye.